I thank the organizers for inviting me here to echo to this very interesting, very thought-provoking conference, and I'm glad also to speak at this point in which we can already to some extent overlook the way of our thought here in the previous days. We started with Heinrich Graetz, and in some way we will come back to Heinrich Graetz again. This is already the basic thesis of my paper. I would like, for a number of important questions, bring our view back to the great German Jewish historian. Now, one of the historical observations that most efficiently displaced the unified Graetzian narrative of Jewish world history concerned the plurality, the duplicity, and the discontinuity of diaspora cultures. The historical interaction of Jewish tradition and the identification with cultural norms of the environment makes an all-embracing conception of Jewish historical identity difficult or even impossible. At this point, one solution, one of the two basic possible solutions, is the fragmentation of the subject area of Jewish studies into a manifold variety of Jewries, Judaisms, and Jewish experiences. The other alternative is a form of dialectics by which the very inauthenticity of the diaspora Jew is seen as an integral part of the Jewish experience. It finds its most typical expressions in a number of oxymora, as in Isaac Deutscher's non-Jewish Jew, Amos Funkenstein's dialectics of assimilations, Jean-François Lyotard's lowercase Jew, Edgar Morin's Judeo-Gentile, or Steve Aschheim's Insider-Outsider paradox, etc., and several other terminological solutions that have tried to spell out the dialectics of enlightenment. My paper will explore the history of what may be called the classic among the Judeo-Gentile oxymora in historiography, namely a term borrowed from medieval Spanish Marrano. A medieval Spanish word of Judeo-Arabic roots meaning pig, Marrano was supposed to name by way of insult the late medieval forced Judeo converts of the Iberian world, as well as their early modern descendants, as long as they did not fully assimilate to Christianity. Being originally an insult, Marrano is irremediably an unprecise term, as it does not allow any rational disentanglement of the categories of race and of choice inherent in it. And a historian who is in any way committed to the ideas of the Enlightenment can obviously not take pleasure in this single word for determinism and choice. My own teachers, Chaim Beinart and Henri Méchoulin, used to avoid this term almost religiously, while other historians, such as Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, have vainly tried to limit its use to a more precise meaning. The flexible and ambiguous character of the Marrano concept makes it regrettable that its modern conceptual history has not yet been explored. We still have to write, as we used to say in good academic English, it's Begriffsgeschichte. One of the results of my present analysis is that the term Marrano was invented as an analytical descriptive concept 150 years ago by Heinrich Graetz in the 8th volume of his History of the Jews, that it corresponded to one of Graetz's key conceptions. Graetz's terminological choice was adopted by many historians of early modern Sephardic Jewry, and through a complex cooperation between fictional and non-fictional discourse, it ended up becoming one of the most popular ciphers for reflections on the oxymoron of Jewish modernity. A few years ago, I devoted a seminar to this literary genre of historicizing reflection. This is the definition given by Edgar Morin, which I called at that occasion Marranosophy, without implying a derogatory connotation. Very roughly, I distinguish three successive waves of interpretive reflection on the topos. The first takes place in 19th century German Jewish fiction and historiography between Heinrich Heine and Graetz. The second emerges in the intellectual history writing of interwar Europe, including Gershom Scholem and three non-Jewish historians of philosophy, Karl Gebhardt, Marcel Bataillon, and Americo Castro. And the third wave arrived during the last decades, starting with Yirmiyahu Yovel, an Israeli philosopher who authored in 1988 a succinct history of modern anti-religious philosophy named Spinoza v'Kofrim Acherim, Spinoza and Other Heretics, which detected the Marranos and the predecessors of this immanentist current of thought, and in addition of modern Jewry as such. Spinoza, the Marrano of reason, translated into the philosophical sphere an existential experience of uprootedness. The book became an amazingly popular text among secular Israelis, to whom it offered a usable Jewish past. Outside Israel, especially in France and Germany, Yovel's work has generated, during the first years of the 21st century, a steady flow of similarly essayistic treatments on Jewish identity. His successors are interested in a certain kind of meta-history, and the Marrano they refer to is not so much an objective fact of early modern Iberian Jewish history, but a symbolic interpretation of the modern oxymoron of Jewish modernity. Shmuel Trigano and Daniel Lindenberg in France have described Marranism, or the essential state of Marranité, the double Judeo-Christian condition, as a syndrome from where all the modern options structurally inherent in the Jewish religion can structurally as well as historically be derived. The authors take care to stress that they understand Marrano as a historico-mental structure in Yovel's terms, as a symbol, according to Shmuel Trigano, as a hidden tradition following Dandiner, a metaphor, a paradigm, or a hypothesis, according to others. In brief, Marranism has become a quite general term that can be referred to any subversion of social coercion through the tenacious affirmation of individual autonomy in secret, while treating this term with a Jewish connotation. To mythless modernity, Marranism provides a Jewish myth of origin. Yovel, who was awarded the Israel Prize of Philosophy in 2000, convinced the Israeli public, but not the professional historians. David Nierenberg suspected Yovel's Marranosophy of owing more to modern stereotypes than to knowledge of the past, and in particular the Sombartian view of Jewish modernity, of modernity as being Jewish, looms here in the background. And in a recent lecture of the AJS Congress in 2014, titled The Myth of Marrano Modernity, Miriam Bodian dismissed the delusive idea according to which the Marranos, in a conflict, was the initial spark that generated the modern autonomy of the subject. And still, in spite of the experts' protest, Marranosophy seems to be there to stay and continues to flourish. The word Marrano, so ambiguous and obviously unfit for scholarly use, has taken root in historical reflection. However mythic, anachronistic, ambiguous, and obvious, and the topos of Marrano modernity expresses an insistent and passionate self-portrait of contemporary Jews and non-Jews that should in its own right attract the attention of the historian. We must keep in mind this important element in contemporary Jewish thought when I turn now to the historical origins among German Jewry of the Emancipation era. At that time, the forced apostasy of late medieval Hispanic Jews was repeatedly quoted as a model of what happened to their modern successors. The parallel was most obvious with those who actually converted, and indeed Heinrich Heine depicted himself, after he received Protestant baptism in 1825, with the features of the Moor al-Mansur, the Muslim convert to Catholicism. But the Iberian mass conversion came to be a metaphor even for those Jews who did not actually convert. The Spanish crypto-Jew embodied the restriction of Jewishness to the limited sphere of personal religious practice after the politically recognized collective framework of community autonomy was abolished and after most of the external markers of difference were abandoned. Medieval mass conversion and modern emancipation corresponded across the illusionary watershed of the Enlightenment. Already in Christian Wilhelm Dohm's famous call for the naturalization of the Prussian Jews, published in 1781, the Iberian converts, called here New Christians or secret Jews, appear as the very models of collective integration. Moses Mendelssohn rejected this historical parallel by insisting on the one obvious difference. German Jews search to maintain the public practice of their religion, which proves their moral sincerity in the pursuit of political rights, precisely in comparison with their Iberian predecessors. Quote, "Couldn't we enjoy all the rights and civil liberties if only we were ready to become hypocrites as our brethren in Portugal and in Spain?" A positive identification with the Iberian converts can first be found among their descendants. In 1790, the delegates of the Jewish nation of Bayonne presented to the National Assembly an address in which they point to their crypto-Jewish ancestors as the precedents of a modern regime of political religious separation. Quote, "The Jews had learned to respect the dominant religion and the imperial law. They limited themselves to an internal devotion, but their faith to it was the most secure guarantee of their faith towards the sovereign. The compromising fact of baptism is masked here with a euphemism to respect the dominant religion. Conversion likewise remains a taboo when the Iberian convert becomes a hero in the earliest versions of Walter Scott's historical novel tradition. Grace Aguilar in England and Ludwig Philippson in Germany inaugurated during the 1830s Jewish historical fiction in the vernacular with novels set in Spain shortly before the expulsion of the Jews. The protagonists are never showed involved in Christian practices, but ultimately suffer martyrdom for their faith. They practice their double religious identity through a strict division of their living spaces between the splendors of the court and a well-protected hideaway where Jewishness can be lived out in all of its authenticity, strictly hidden from Christian eyes. Philippson imagines a catacomb where the secret Jews meet, just like the Christian martyrs of contemporary catacomb novels, which post-secularization Catholics so much cherished. Both novels avoid any inner religious conflict, as their intrigues are unfolded by the love the secret Jewish heroine feels for a Christian knight. In a word, the novels evoke ambivalent situations, not ambivalent identities. Now, Ludwig Philippson's novel, published in 1837 under the name of his brother Phoebus, bears the exotic title Die Marranen. The author thus uses a term that had been presented to the European public by Juan Antonio Llorente, a former secretary of the Spanish Inquisition, who inaugurated in 1817 the critical historiography on his institution. Llorente mentioned the different insults converted Jews, he also calls them the new Christians, had to endure. And in this context, he at one point states that the old Christians continue treating them as Jews, while their former Jewish brethren now called them by the name of Marrano, to which Llorente gave an imaginative etymology from Aramaic. In 1832 and 1834, Llorente's considerations were retaken by two German historians, Isaac Marcus Jost, a Frankfurt Jewish schoolmaster, and Georg Bernhard Depping, a German Catholic author who migrated to France. Jost uses alternatively the terms New Christians and Secret Jews, while Depping speaks generally about converts. At one single moment, each author reports the Spanish Jewish insult Marrano, which Jost renders as Marranen, simple R, double N, and Depping as Marranen, double R, simple N. Philippson, whose Marranen has a single R and double N as in Jost, is not aware of any special semantics of the word, which he applies to Jews as well as to converts. He seems to use the word mainly in order to provide a local color to his description and to caricature the intense Jew hatred of the Christian persecutors. Let me conclude that the word Marrano entered into the European languages as an archaeological discovery that is part of the artificial Middle Ages evoked by the Romantics. It bears no clear meaning, but opens a vague field of emotional associations, mainly consisting in the link between collective de-Judaization on the one hand and heroic suffering, martyrdom, inquisition on the other hand. As mentioned above, the Marrano was not yet a split personality in Philippson, but he became one in a novella that Ludwig August Frankl published in 1854 in Philippson's journal. Frankl here presents a Spanish protagonist who, separated as a child from his crypto-Jewish parents, becomes an inquisitor and is about to condemn his own sister to death when one night his mother enters the Inquisition's palace and confronts him with his origins, by baring her breasts before him. There is a double level of existence, day and night, public and private, male and female, religious education, Christian education, and the nude Jewish body. Fleeing a double life that no spatial division can harmonize, the protagonist then leaves Spain and becomes a Jew abroad. And now we come to Heinrich Graetz. Heinrich Graetz had pondered the lessons of historians and the fiction of novelists when in 1864 he arrived at the Judeo-Convert chapter in volume 8. His treatment was very original for the standards of the time, as Graetz meets and fights here with the three major enemies of historical conceptualization and unification that I have initially mentioned: plurality, duplicity, and discontinuity. To start with, Graetz is the first historian to recognize the heterogeneity of the convert group, which included, apart from those who remained Jews in secret, large fringes of fanatic Christians, ambitious conformists, indifferent, frivolous, or scared persons. However, Graetz is not ready to give up the unity of the group. As he writes, I quote, "The Baptist Jews who remained in Spain formed a group by themselves, Christians on the outside and Jews in the insides. One may name them Jewish Christians. Even the monks and church dignitaries of Jewish stock could not pass the religious border entirely. They formed a class of carrierists who had been indifferent to religion even before their conversions. Once they were free from the constraints of the Jewish religion," Graetz writes, "they adapted externally to Christianity. They became even devout of this if it offered some advantage, but they did neither gain in religiosity nor in morality. All members of the group thus share a complex psychology. Any soul which resigns to a double practice must transform, split, deny itself. Even among the converts who remained sincerely faithful to Judaism in their hearts, Graetz postulates inner struggles, Seelenkämpfe. And he gives the example of one of his heroines, finally a feminine heroine in Graetz, Doña Gracia Nassi, who experiences jointly, I quote, "the love of the ancestral religion which she had to deny, and the revulsion against the imposed Catholic credo that she had to practice daily through attending church, falling on her knees, and confessing sins. She longed to a country where she could follow her heart inflamed for Judaism." Tracing the dynamic outcome of religious alienation, Graetz invents the narrative structure of de-Judaization, which is the third innovative element in his treatment of the topic. He finishes the 9th volume canonizing the legendary tale of Daniel Levi de Barrios on the foundation of the Jewish community of Amsterdam. This allows Graetz to finish on an optimist note. Through persecution and abnegation, Sephardi Judaism arrives at a new reconstruction that would ultimately lead to a sort of equality. Where Jews simply states that all the Baptists remained nevertheless Jews, Graetz brings a pioneering nuance into his picture of the group that suffered forced conversion. It appears simultaneously as diverse, double, and dynamic. But while stressing the 3 Ds of critical historiography, Graetz copes with the ensuing fugacious historical reality by locking it into a common term. And in this 1864 volume, Graetz is now the first to use the term Marrano, not as an alleged specimen of Spanish popular speech, as Joost and others had done before him, but as a fully fledged historical analytical concept which will appear in the very title of the 9th volume in 1866 with a reference to the permanent settlement of the Marranos in Holland. Taken from polemical language, the Marrano cipher is capable of embracing the extremes and expressing the idea that, I quote, "even after they had received baptism, the Jews remained the same as before, blind and obstinate, that is, loyal to the faith of their ancestors." The Marrano reference restitutes Jewishness in its concentric, hierarchic, and teleological parameters. Graetz's solution to cover a complex reality with a simple and ambivalent term must be seen on the background of his general hesitation between 2 conceptions of Jewish identity, an idealistic and an ethnic one, a struggle that Markus Pica has well analyzed in a recent book. Still in 1853, Graetz accredited literature as the core of Jewish history, but in 1860, with the introduction to Volume 5, he accomplishes a conscious turn towards a cultural history which, he says, I quote, has not individual minds as its bearers, but an entire nation, a folk. Graetz now insists on the national character that's singularizing Jewish history even after the Talmudic period, and he describes this ethnic dimension during the 1860s with the terminology that dominated German historiography at the time, namely the folk, the ethnic nation, and Stamm, the tribe. United by ethnic origin, Jewry remained at the same time a community of memory, culture, and expectation. Graetz did not see any conflict between the biological and the cultural definition of ethnicity, but, quote, an interaction between the national body and the national soul. Not only the popularity of the history of the Jews, but also its repercussion in novels by Philipson and Marcus Lehmann assured the neologism Marrano its prompt success among the German, French, and English public. Only recently did the forgotten medieval insult wander back to Spain. Encapsulated in a deeply ambivalent word, Graetz has been able to pass on to his readers, and furthermore to an entire current of modern Jewish thought, his organicist metaphor of the equation between the national body and the national soul. Rather surprisingly, a worldview of romantic nationalism from Richard Wagner's age stands behind the Marranosophy, which in Jovel's late 20th century formulation could praise anti-religious rebellion and universal rationality, while still laying a claim to a canonic Jewish past. It is this hidden presence of 19th century traditions that accounts for the belated character of the contemporary cult of the Marrano. The historicism it manifests is not a concern with the marginal zones of Sephardi history, but through them engages obliquely with a discredited yet attractive heritage from the romantic ethno-nationalism of Germany. Thank you.